Thank you so much for having us. And thank you all for joining us. It's great to be able to have an in-person event and to bring artists together for conversations. Thank you, Annalise, for hosting us. We're really grateful to be able to be here in LA. We're actually just coming out of a sort of midpoint weekend in the exhibition where both Serge and Chris organized performances that activated their installations. Before I dive into some questions for Chris and for Serge, I think it's interesting to talk a little bit about context. We were one of the first large-scale art events to open since the pandemic started. It was a difficult exhibition to put on. It's a very different kind of exhibition. It's not a show about a pandemic, but it was inevitably shaped by one. And that meant that both from choosing locations to the scale of the projects, to how many there are, to the geographical sort of placement of them across the valley, decisions like making sure that it's a show you could see in a day because we weren't sure if hotels were going to be open had to be made, which is why it's a much more compacted exhibition. Also, the process that the artists engaged was very different because instead of being able to conduct multiple site visits, most were able to only conduct one. So even for Neville, my co-curator who's here with us, the artistic director, the projects, the way we developed these projects with artists was very different. It was a lot of Zoom calls, a lot of FaceTimes in terms of site locations. So it was a process that was very different for us, and I think that inevitably shaped the projects. It was also a very different year. There was a lot of conversations about social inequities and a lot of political uprisings, and you see that reflected in the projects. And both Serge and Chris tackled that on, I think, in two very different ways. Chris, I think, was very invested in the relationship to rethinking monuments and public history. And then Serge was having conversations about issues of environmental justice, which in the Coachella Valley are incredibly important, particularly on the east side with issues to access to water. So can you tell us a little bit about, your process in the beginning and if you had a different idea for a project, and then what happened a month into that invitation into getting you to start thinking about what you eventually made for us?
Hello, everyone. For me, I think Desert X exhibition it was a challenge for me because I'm used to working with the community. Labadi is a suburb of Accra, the capital city, and it's sort of like small, overpopulated, and you can imagine where I come from to deal with this huge space, the desert. So I wasn't sure how that is going to work. Imagine, because desert, like to Africans coming from the continent, desert may represent struggle, and how can I create work on the desert? For me, it was a challenge. But then, looking at what I'm interested as an artist and looking at like subjects of environment, water, I'm interested in water and how my community is going through the water scarcity. It's a global pandemic. Water is a global pandemic, and I think water is a human right. The work, changed over time because I'm interested in working with broken boats. Then I thought, okay, boats represent migration, but water is very important as well because the water navigates the world. So I decided to create these cubes, which is very relatable to an urban structure back in Ghana, because in Ghana there are like property conflicts. Government has taken most of the properties from the people. So if you want to acquire a house or a room, there's ideal scale size of structure that you can build. And I kind of like link that to the desert because the desert is a big space and you are allowed to build whatever you want. But where I'm from is very specific. The cube was something that I thought was an ideal installation for the desert because we are struggling with water scarcity, and we have like giant water storage system in Ghana, which was built by individual people who want to support the community. So the cube was something that I think was perfect. But like all this thing, because then I have to deal with space, I have to think about like the context and and also think about the material that I use.
Similar to Serge, I'm so not from Coachella Valley, right? Like there's this moment where I'm super from New York, and we're doing these site visits. You keep going, you're like, all right, I see that's mad dirt. I got you. It's smooth, it's dirt, right? I got you. And then Caesar's like, how about this other place? You're like, Yeah, that's also dirt. I got you. It's real smooth, and there's a mountain there. But one of the things that became increasingly obvious and useful as a jumping off point as the pandemic raged was this idea that there is no place that's neutral, right? Like even though people go to the desert and they think of the desert often as a neutral landscape, as an empty space from which to like clear their heads and their mind, there is no neutral space. How do I acknowledge that? How do I acknowledge that in everything that I'm doing? The strange thing about Palm Springs, Coachella Valley, there's lots and lots of pieces of public art. You know, city councils erect sculptures to, you know, former mayors who massacred lots of people. And then you realize, I want to do something that sort of fights that as well. I mean, as you see on the video, like, I'm interested in the idea of like, not only replacing monuments, because I think so often we get into this cycle of like, let's tear it down and put up somebody new, but let's think about the logic of monument itself. How do you rewrite that? How do you say, it's not about who we have on the horse, it's about the idea that maybe there should be no one on the horse. Maybe it should be a place for us to imagine ourselves into. There are communities of people who have come together in this place and built a life for themselves, who have, as the old folks in my community say, made a way out of no way. What do you do with that? How do you honor that sense of community? How do you replace that logic of monument, which is the celebration of one man or one, and instead celebrate a community?
I want to talk to you about how much the events of that particular year shape the process of these installations. In a normal year, we would have been working on this show and had the big tourist season, the music festivals, the tennis tournaments, all like that would have been the context under which all of you would have been doing site visits for your projects. We had a very quiet desert to work in, and it was a really fascinating experience. How much did the context of events elsewhere shape it? Because you weren't there day to day. You did one site visit. We were all sort of having conversations and, you know, talking about the uprisings or water issues in the Coachella Valley. How much attention were you paying to things that were happening locally from far away? And how much did that shape these projects?
When I first got to Palm Springs for the first time, I felt like it was empty, you know, like there was nobody living there. I think people come for vacations, and they just leave because most of the shops were closed. And I was wondering how this work would come in visibility, you know, because I'm far from America. I'm from Africa, and I think that we do our things quite different.
Every locality has its own like mythology, and every locality has its own like news cycle. If you work in a lot of different contexts, like I do, you become super obsessed with like the news cycle of the places that you're working in. I became sort of obsessed with the news cycle of Palm Desert. It's a place in which people are constantly imagining and reimagining themselves. You know, every story is really them trying to define their community. I became more interested in the idea of the kind of local politics of the place. The fact that you've got Gene Autry Way. All of the like classic Hollywood cowboys are mentioned on the street signs. And I began to sort of think about the way in which the image of the cowboy is something that still dogs like the idea of America, right? So when I'm in, at some point I asked my old guys in Nairobi about their exposure to horses. And my man George was like, George Jiroge, if you're in 5 miles outside Nairobi, you can holler at him. He's like, I never saw a horse. I saw a horse in movies. I saw a horse in magazines. I saw a horse as what it means to be America. But I've been seeing a horse like that. And that is the kind of resonance this imagery has. And I'm sort of interested in the way in which there is this like image of the horse that comes from Gene Autry and Roy Rogers and all of those Western icons. It's exported throughout the world, and then we get this image back. we get this horse back that is the American horse through the eyes of me, through the eyes of George Jaroge. That kind of circular conversation is fascinating to me.
I mean, every single month there's something, César email, it gives me headache because, I'm used to my community. I feel like I'm a king home, whereby you migrate elsewhere, you don't exist, So all these things was for me, I think César pushed me very hard, to think outside my space, and then the idea was the yellow brick road, which I can control because it's ongoing project. Then it's changed again, different locations, and another article about my work being rejected and all that. So I'm back home and I was like, how can a king be rejected somewhere else? And I thought, okay, it's possible, but and then I got lost at some point because there was something, someone has planned bomb or want to plant bomb. It's very challenging for me because I don't want to see my work being exploded or something, because for me, the entire community will be disappointed because we create from our hearts, so it's more personal. Like my work is like a layer of my skin, so you can imagine the layer being peeled away or so. And I think the community engagement has really involved the work. And back home, people felt like we need something here. This shouldn't be in California, in Palm Springs. This is for us. This is what belongs to us. So I intend to create a mirror of the installation back in Ghana, which is actually well celebrated, because it's something that we own it, And I realized that the work is more it's beyond just an artwork. It's more like humanity, something that has to be attached to something.
To give a little bit of context about the changes of site, working on a public art exhibition is never easy. And this particular project faced many differences of opinion between our team and elected officials in a lot of the cities across the desert. I think that there's a long history of land art that is meant to really fall into the seductive landscape, and you can encounter a beautiful earthwork that gives you a meditation space. But this time, because there was so much mediation between artists not being able to do site visits and us having to share information about places, pieces were responding to particular issues across the city as opposed to just the landscape itself. And so when you look at the exhibition as a whole, while they're all engaging the desert, they're engaging it not just as a physical landscape. And so with Serge's work in particular, we wanted to cite in the East Coachella Valley, which are cities that are largely populated by Latino people, African American people, and there's huge water issues with arsenic in the water, huge agricultural community of traveling laborers. And so you had moments where the folks, elected officials there felt that this work was too close to home and drew too much attention to issues that maybe they were complicit in creating or not resolving. And eventually, the location for Serge's work ended in a community center and park on the northern part of Palm Springs that historically has been an African American community. And after they read in the papers that we didn't have a home for the work, they invited us to bring the work to them. So in many ways, the work found its home through this collaboration. And it's interesting because two things came out of these projects. One is that Serge's project also revived conversations about the elected officials in Palm Springs' relationship to an incident in the 1960s where a huge African-American neighborhood was burnt down by the city itself. And the city has never offered a formal apology for that event, which now, as a result of conversations I like to think we helped instigate, it is now back on the table for city council discussion. And just as we're speaking now, along the route where Chris's horses are, there is a statue of a former very problematic mayor of the city in front of City Hall that's been a monument that people have wanted to remove. And tonight they'll vote to see if that horse with that man will get removed permanently and reinstalled with a different kind of monument. So I think that the conversations that both of your projects brought up started to seep in way beyond just these kind of very particular histories of land art.
Now, like, if I see the work, I have so many ideas that I want to expand because of how the work has been received so far. The contrast is beautiful, but the material itself represents a problem. So how do people reflect or interact with the work? Because I'm selling my problem. That is how I see it, because these gallons represent a problem whereby it has been manipulated, transformed into these sculpture pieces where people come and just jump on it. They feel like, oh, this is a celebration. But back in Ghana, when people see the tons of gallon, they panic. So I think that the work, somehow, geographical locations change the form and maybe value of the work.
Both of you offered to make sort of performance works to activate both of these pieces. Serge, you did a performance yourself, and then Chris, you collaborated with two musicians to make a work. I want to talk a little bit about what the role of collaboration was for you in these pieces.
When you make things, and you make things over and over again, most of your work is about this conversation that you're having with yourself, right? I'm in my studio most of the time, having long conversations with myself aloud. Recently, somebody was like, I want to do a Zoom studio visit with you. I was like, so you're going to listen to me talk to myself? All right, cool. But this project ends up being a conversation that I'm having Desert X, with César, with the Coachella Valley, with the Palm Springs City Council. All of a sudden, people are calling me up and asking me about my relationship to Saudi. I'm talking with my guys in Nairobi. I'm talking with the flag makers that I work with in Denmark. This conversation just spun out of control in certain ways. It became a really big conversation, and that it's challenging for someone who likes to be in the studio talking to himself, but it's also kind of enriching, to make that conversation wider, to make that conversation with the history of a place, with international shippers. Like we're sitting, this was the big problem with this one, was how do we get these horses from Nairobi to LA? That was an odyssey in and of itself, and even to be in conversation with other artists, to realize that my conversation that's in Nairobi and Denmark is also with you in Ghana, and that conversation is wide and rich, to meet the brothers who were the heads of the community center that your work was placed at, and to sit and have a meal with them and you and me, and that kind of conversation, that's what it's about. And there's something really exciting about the width and the breadth of that conversation.
I think my process is kind of I would say it's trust, because César doesn't know the people that I work with. César knows only me, so I'm like the central person to the people that I work with and to the curator, so and especially where we source the gallons, they have no idea. I have to okay, I need 100,000 gallons. I go to the copper wire. I have to tell them that I need this to survive as a human. So it's based on trust, and it's based on collaborations, because they see the work online. Someone who sells the copper wire to me, go on Facebook, see the work online, say, wow, so this is what is actually happening. So then they get more involved. And then expand, so it has to be sort of trust that, okay, I buy from you, you make money, but then you have to make sure that you have to be consistent, because that will help, my production and all that. So I think what I've learned so far is, to trust deeply. The guys back in Ghana, all they do is social media to track what is happening, because then the work navigates elsewhere, and that is it. It's not coming back to Ghana. They are not going to see it. The only time they can see it through social media platforms. So that also, sort of encourage them that, okay, though we live in Africa, we live in the small village, but what we do is global. So I think that it's trust.
How hard was it when I start thinking about who's going to do this show after me, or who's going to do another large-scale exhibition that depends this kind of logistical situation, that we don't know if we're all going to be traveling and holding space at a big art fair or at a big opening at a next Venice Biennale. These shows are going to look different. And it's not just Desert X. It's all of these large-scale shows that depend on all these audiences from elsewhere flying out, and an art economy that is so dependent on that. And this show's much more grounded in many ways. Even if you work with people everywhere, we saw what that is going to look like in this new reality. So what have you learned from that? And if an artist said, how did you make this work? What would be the things you tell them now?
When I get something made with my guys in Nairobi, I say it like it's a smooth, easy thing. And really, this is like a 5-year relationship with people that I've been working with. And there's so much personal relationship there. There's so much conversation relationship there. I work a lot, I do a lot of tapestry work with people in Egypt. And when I'm doing that work, there's like 100,000 WhatsApps, and then there's Kamal speaking her Lebanese Arabic to the Egyptian Arabic. And then when we get really, really, really tough, we get Kamal's aunt on the phone because she's like rough, and her Lebanese Arabic is rougher. But like, there is this different way of doing things. I don't have fabricators that are like Xerox machines, right? I can't send someone a file and then it's made. And that I had to learn that had a legitimacy, and I had to learn to trust it in a way that I didn't really even fully understand. And that was the hard thing of this project. At some point, somebody texted my guys. They texted George Deroge, and I got a phone, because those guys don't have email, they got text. And I got a text message from Nairobi that said, "The whites are calling from Los Angeles. What should I do? The whites are here." Yeah. And I was a little bit like, bruh, like, number one, don't worry, I got you, George. Also, I had to be like, dear whites, please don't text them. You know, and it's interesting to learn the specialness of my own process and to trust it, and to learn that thing about, you know, I know my people, I know my folks. This is a personal relationship, and this is what this work lives in. The beauty of it lives in those kind of personal moments.
Did you have any moments when we were working on this when you asked yourselves if we should be doing this project? But did you ever have those questions in all the site changes and delays and realities that this world has that we're living through? And did you think that a project like this was necessary?
When I saw the article about bomb and stuff, I like, God, I mean, if my work can be bombed, then I'm just nothing. Because one of my uncles saw the article, you know, who has been very supportive, because they gave me the space, which is the family compound that I use for production. So when I sent him, he called me right away and he said, do you think, I don't think you should do it, you know, because no, if your work, you know, is going through that risk, you know, I don't think, just tell them you are not interested. We prefer showing your work in Ghana, do your installation, engage the community. And then I said, no, let me call him. I called him and said, no. Once there's that response, it means that we are making an effort, you know, so let's get it going. But I mean, when I had the bomb for the first time, like, no. And even it's about my work, and it's online. So I want to redraw. I don't want that image. I took the challenge, but there was fear in my head, and I think that just accept that I'll do this is sort of courage. Yeah.
Your practice as an artist is to dream things that you don't think are going to, that no one else is dreaming. Some other idea that is not possible. Like, not possible is where you start. And adding more not possible helps in some strange way. You know, you realize that, like, leaving some emptiness behind is not going to be useful. You know, it reminds me, years ago in another life, I write books for kids. I was invited to the White House. It was like the White House I didn't want to go to. It was. I mean, it wasn't as bad as this last White House, but it was a White House I didn't want to go to. And my boys were like, "You shouldn't go. That's George W. He's a horrible person." I was like, "Yeah, it's true. It's true." But then I also had this idea of, like, but I'm already not there, right? I'm already not in that space. And similarly with this work, my absence doesn't add anything. You know, to not do something is the choice that is really comfortable, because you're like, well, I didn't do anything, see? I want to do things, and I want to do things with this community. And I mean that in the community of the Coachella Valley or Palm Springs, but this community of like 3 of us sitting up here, 3 like random folks who like care a lot about world issues and thinking about stuff.
And at some point, I personally felt like the exhibition demanded I surrender certain things that weren't going to happen in the way I was used to them happening anymore. And the show has become completely different for me now, looking at it as it's halfway through. And it has an audience that I don't necessarily know I anticipated, because it's not necessarily all of my friends and colleagues coming into a biennial opening, but it's like these families that send you random Instagram messages because their mom remembers sleeping in one of the petates of Eduardo Sarave's installation, or the kids in the basketball league at the community center who give better tours than I do of your work to people who come and they tell them why the piece is in their park. So I think the last sort of the question that I have is, are you, now that you've done the site visit and come back, do you see the work differently? Is it a new piece, like based on these interactions?
I think when I first saw the piece, I was blown away in terms of the form of the work, like where it has been installed, because I felt like the interaction was very sincere, because I have people like touching the work, others to ask me if they can touch the work, others ask if they can work on the work, so I think that the work has really translated into very humanity, like in a way that, it's not just about the story of the space, but like it has become very close to people. Like it has, I don't know how to explain, but when I saw the work, I felt like the performance was very important to activate, because then, you give people the access, to interact more, because they feel like, okay, this is a sculpture piece. But back in Ghana, the kids ride bicycle on the work, cars drive on it. Like it's something that it represents a problem. So like to get rid of, like this is gallon, like just drive on, all that. But here, people are like, oh, can I touch it? Can I walk on it? I'm like, really? This Ghana, we ride on it, we jump on it, we do everything. So really, so for me, the performance was to, give them the access, to like, okay, this was made by other people that you don't know, but in your space, this is just what it is. Take it or leave it. Especially some of the, like, seeing the grass coming out of plastic, it's very heartbreaking in a way, because plastic has caused a lot of problems globally, but in Ghana, like, it's affecting our agriculture, it's affecting like fishermen and all that. But here, when the work was installed, like the grass coming out give you a sense of the future. Like, we have struggles, but it will go away. We will survive, we'll make it. So it's to encourage people to be hopeful.
There's a way in which no matter what I make, it always has like some kind of urban thing in it, because I am so New York-y. The way there's this gap between the way you dream something and then the way it lives. The way this lives, when I get there, when I see it for the first time, and I relate to that moment of like shock and surprise and awe of like, yo, this is living in the world, is that these pieces end up being like walking pieces, right? They're not all localized, and this is much more like a conversation. This is like a long walk with some friends down a main drag in the middle of Palm Springs, and I like that. And I like that it's like a way that I think that the work won for me that I didn't anticipate, because you think about the work as the work. You don't think of it as the walk. You don't think of it as the conversation amongst friends. You don't think of it as a piece and then another piece and another piece that ends up asking a question about, why do we do this? Why do we put people on horses? What is that about? And I love the conversation and the conversations I've had with folks around. The conversations with the brothers from the community center that your work was at. The conversations with like people leaning out of windows who happen to live on East Taquitz Canyon Way and are saying to me, yo, are they going to keep those there? I hope they're going to keep those there. They've been empty for mad long. And you're like, yeah, I hope so too. You know, and that kind of conversation, there is no amount of dreaming in my studio that was going to equal that.
Well, I didn't see all the works, but I think in terms of like interacting with space, I think all the work did exactly the same. And because, I mean, you are driving and you see the Indian land, you know, like just pass by, then you are entering into, like you can see my piece from across, you know, to England, Indian land. So I think that I see a lot of photos, but I didn't get to see all the installations. But I feel there's something that has to do with intervention. You know, intervention is what I see within all the space, because this exhibition has really brought people into the space, and then it's sort of like out of curiosity you engage with other people sharing the same space, having to discuss the work, and you know, I think that the work has really created sort of like community, you know, who doesn't even exist, you know. So one way or the other, you leave Palm Springs and you still have that, oh, I met someone at these particular installations, and you know, we discuss something, and then, you know, yeah.
Coach, the Valley, it's not one community. It's about 15 to 25 overlapping communities, right? And that's one of the things people ask you, like, what's the nature of the Valley? You're like, it depends on who you ask and what day. What's exciting about all of the work in the exhibition is that it casts a wide net, and it touches all of these communities. You've got indigenous artists, you've got people thinking about environmental work, you have the creation of mythology, you have people dealing with like white homesteaders back in the day. All of those communities are being touched and being thought about. You've got, you know, Chicano artists dealing with kind of histories and futures of what it means to be queer, like all kinds of hot stuff. And I love that it really casts this wide net over a collection of communities that have that overlap and sometimes recognize each other and sometimes don't. And that's a challenge that these guys took up, and you can see it.
When Evo and I had early conversations, the one sort of very early thing we talked about was that we were going to encourage artists to look at the desert beyond just this physical place. And I'll admit that it is an incredibly seductive landscape. The more and more I started spending time there, it's hard not to do that. It is. And then you start spending time there, not during Coachella, and not because you're going to the tennis tournament or a bachelorette party, but because you're actually going to spend time with the people who have to live there. Because you have to remember that the population there, when it's not in season, the people who can choose to live here leave. The people who have to live there stay. And that, I think, is what drives the conversation between these two projects. Because it's also for folks that can't afford to go back to Chicago or New York when it gets too hot, because they have to work the hotels that those people coming in for bachelorettes have to stay at. And so my goal was that we were going to speak to both of those audiences. And I think in doing that, I think the project started to tap into very different communities. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you to Britely and Annalise for hosting us as well.